Welcome to AI Book Highlights.
Hello.
Today we're getting into Javier Milei's Capitalismo, Socialismo y la Trampa Neoclásica. You asked us to explore this one. To get a clearer picture of these fundamental clashes between economic ideas and, well, what actually happens in the world.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Miley is how he really tries to connect economic theory directly to historical data. It's not just abstract models.
Right, he keeps grounding it. So our plan for this session is to pull out Miley's core arguments, identify the key insights he presents, and give you some practical ways to think about these ongoing economic debates.
Sounds good.
So where does he kick things off?
He starts with a really striking visual he calls the hockey stick of economic growth.
Okay.
Imagine plotting global GDP per capita from year zero way up to, say, the present day. For almost all of human history, that line is basically flat, like incredibly flat. That's the handle of the stick.
Right.
Miley points out that from year zero to about 1800, the annual compound growth rate was tiny 0.02%.
Wow, 0.02.
Yeah. At that rate, it would take something like 3,500 years just to double GDP per capita.
Incredible. So millennia stagnation, essentially.
Pretty much. He does note a small bump, about 48% increase over that whole period, mostly after the 16th century, linked to the discovery of America and more trade, but still fundamentally flat.
So what changed? What makes the graph curve upwards?
Around 1800, you start to see the adoption of capitalism, and that's where the blade of the hockey stick takes off. The growth rates just explode, relatively speaking.
Okay.
In the 19th century, growth hits 0.66% per year. Now doubling takes about 107 years.
Not faster.
Much faster. Then 1900 to 1950, it's 1.66% annual growth, doubling in 66 years. 1950 to 2000, it jumps again to 2.1%. Doubling time, just 33 years.
That's accelerating rapidly.
It is. And from 2000 to 2023, he estimates around 3% annual growth, which means doubling potentially every 23 years.
So the overall picture is stark.
Absolutely. Since the Industrial Revolution, GDP per capita has multiplied, he says, over 15 times. And he directly links this to lifting about 90% of the world's population out of deep poverty.
And this huge success, this incredible growth, driven by, well, what look like increasing returns. That leads him to a core question, doesn't it?
Exactly. He asks, how can parts of economic theory view these increasing returns, which seem so tied to human flourishing, as a negative thing or as a problem?
Like a market failure.
Precisely. It's a central puzzle he tries to unravel. Why the disconnect between theory and this historical reality?
Okay, so moving on from the big picture growth, he delves into Adam Smith, right? The pin factory and the invisible hand.
Yes. And his argument here is that these two famous concepts are not in conflict, as some later interpretations might suggest. He sees them as completely complementary, essential, really, for understanding that hockey stick growth.
How so?
Well, the pin factory is Smith's classic example of specialization and division of labor leading to massive productivity gains. You know, one person alone makes maybe 20 pins, but 10 people specializing can make thousands. 5,000 pins a day in Smith's example. That's increasing returns to scale, plain and simple.
Okay, that makes sense. And the invisible hand.
That's the idea that individuals pursuing their own interests in a free market, through voluntary cooperation and exchange, unintentionally benefit society as a whole. Now, the problem, or the perceived problem, comes later with neoclassical economics, particularly with the influence of Pareto optimality. The idea that an optimal state is one where you can't make anyone better off without making someone else worse off.
And increasing returns don't fit neatly into that.
They can seem problematic. Mathematically, increasing returns can lead to situations, convex functions without a clear maximum point, which complicates the neat conditions for Pareto optimality. So some saw a conflict between Smith's observation of increasing returns and his idea of the smoothly functioning invisible hand leading to an optimal outcome.
But Miley says Smith himself didn't see this conflict.
Right. Miley argues Smith understood these were intertwined. He also points out Smith talked about learning by doing and technological progress, other drivers of increasing productivity that emerge naturally from market activity.
Okay.
And he contrasts this dynamic, optimistic view of Smith with Malthus's pessimism.
Ah, Malthus. Diminishing returns, population outpacing food, wages stuck at subsistence.
Exactly, the iron law of wages. But Miley just points to the hockey stick graph again and says, look, history since 1800 completely refutes Malthus. Population exploded, yes, but wealth per person exploded even more.
So Smith's insights on increasing returns seem much more aligned with what actually happened.
That's Miley's argument. which leads him to his critique of what he calls the neoclassical trap.
Okay, what's the trap?
The trap, according to Miley, is that neoclassical economics, by focusing so much on identifying market failures, like these non-convexities from increasing returns or externalities or public goods, provides the intellectual justification for state intervention.
So the theory itself opens the door for the government to step in.
Precisely. The framework of Pareto optimality defines this perfect ideal state. Anything deviating from it, like a situation with increasing returns or an externality, gets labeled a market failure, and the proposed solution is often government correction.
But Miley flips that argument.
He does. He says, wait a minute. Before you blame the market for failing, look closely. Is the state already involved somehow? He strongly suggests that many, maybe most, of these so-called market failures are actually the result of previous government interventions, regulations, taxes, subsidies, whatever.
So the failure isn't inherent to the market process itself.
In his view, no. He defines the market as simply a process of voluntary social cooperation through the exchange of property rights. Left alone, he argues, it doesn't inherently fail in this theoretical sense. The problems arise, he believes, when this voluntary process is interfered with.
And what's the danger of intervening to fix these perceived failures?
Miley draws on thinkers like Mises and Hayek here. He argues that these interventions, even if well-intentioned, create distortions and instabilities. And crucially, they tend to lead to more intervention down the line. It creates a dynamic that pushes towards ever-increasing state control towards socialism.
Can you give an example?
He mentions regulating monopolies. It might seem necessary if a company gets large due to increasing returns, but he argues that regulation can easily stifle the very innovation and creative destruction that keeps markets dynamic and ultimately benefits consumers. It protects incumbents and prevents the next big thing from emerging.
Okay, that's the trap intervention leads to more intervention. Now, Miley's views on the state itself are quite strong. He calls it a criminal organization.
Yes, that's probably his most provocative framing. His argument is that the state fundamentally lives off coercion. It finances itself through taxation, which he views as theft, a forced extraction of resources.
Even for things like roads or schools, or just beyond basic security and justice.
He sees the only legitimate functions of the state as security and justice, protecting property rights and enforcing contracts. Anything beyond that, financed by coercive taxes, he considers illegitimate, part of this criminal organization. He even critiques things like the Laffer curve discussion,
Which suggests cutting tax rates might increase revenue.
Right. While acknowledging the dynamic effects, Miley's fundamental point is that the debate shouldn't be about the optimal level of taxation for state revenue, but about the morality of any taxation beyond the bare minimum for protection.
And he extends this view to all forms of government finance.
Absolutely. Direct taxes are theft. Government debt, that's just future taxes, so it's also illegitimate in his view. And monetary emission printing money.
He sees that as a tax, too.
Yes, the inflation tax, or seigniorage. He considers it a particularly deceitful and harmful form of taxation.
Why particularly harmful?
Because, he argues, inflation disproportionately hurts the poor and those on fixed incomes, people who can't easily protect themselves from rising prices. It distorts economic calculation, hinders investment, and ultimately undermines growth. He views financing deficits by printing money seigniorage as the ultimate swindle.
So his commitment isn't just no new taxes, it's much deeper.
Exactly. It's rejecting the legitimacy of most existing taxes and explicitly rejecting debt and monetary emission as alternative hidden forms of the same fundamental problem: coercive extraction of wealth by the state.
Moving to the final highlight, Miley talks about a shift in what he calls the socialist agenda. What's his argument there?
He contends that the practical failures of traditional collectivist economic systems, central planning, and so on became undeniable. Think Soviet Union, etc. So he argues proponents of socialism had to pivot. They couldn't win purely on the economic argument of class struggle anymore.
So they shifted their focus.
Yes. He believes they started framing other societal divisions as the new battlegrounds for advancing state control. Instead of just worker versus capitalist, the focus shifted to other perceived conflicts.
What kinds of conflicts?
He specifically mentions two main areas. First, what he calls radical feminism, framing it as promoting a conflict between men and women. He argues this ultimately leads to more state bureaucracy and intervention, rather than the genuine equality he believes libertarianism already provides through equal rights.
Okay, that's one. What's the second?
The second is environmentalism, particularly focusing on the climate change agenda and population control measures, including abortion, which he often links to this agenda. He critiques these viewpoints as being, in his opinion, based on flawed science or ignoring natural cycles, and argues their proposed solutions harm human progress and prosperity.
And he sees a unifying strategy behind these different movements.
He connects it to the idea of cultural Marxism, drawing on Gramsci. The notion that socialist proponents aim to gain influence by shaping culture, education, and media, gradually shifting societal norms to favor state intervention and undermine traditional values associated with capitalism and individual liberty.
And the end goal is
Still, increased state control, erosion of private property, and ultimately expropriation. He points to examples like Venezuela as the outcome of this path.
And his counter is a defense of capitalism.
A very strong defense. He argues it's not just more productive, but also more just because it's based on voluntary exchange. Successful entrepreneurs aren't exploiters. They are social benefactors because they only succeed by satisfying consumer needs better or cheaper than competitors.
And this connects back to the neoclassical trap.
Yes. His concern is that even people who believe in free markets, classical liberals, if they accept the standard neoclassical framework with its emphasis on market failures, they might inadvertently support interventions that, in Miley's view, ultimately strengthen the socialist agenda they oppose. By conceding the need for the state to fix the market, they open the door.
Okay, that pulls together a lot of his core arguments. Based on all this, what are some key actionable takeaways for you, for the listener?
Right. I think the first one is really question the term market failure when you hear it.
All right.
Ask, like Miley suggests, is the state already involved here? Could this failure be a result of earlier intervention? Or maybe it's just part of the messy, dynamic process of market discovery and adaptation, not a failure at all. Challenge that premise.
That's a good critical thinking exercise. What's number 2?
Second, really try to grasp the difference between economic outlooks based on diminishing returns versus those emphasizing increasing returns.
Like Malthus versus Smith, in a way.
Exactly. Or certain neoclassical growth models versus endogenous growth theories that focus on innovation and knowledge. Understanding whether a model assumes things eventually run down or assumes potential for ongoing progress driven by human ingenuity, that fundamentally shapes views on growth, limits, and the role of the state. It's a core difference.
Recognizing the underlying assumptions.
Yeah.
Got it. And a final takeaway.
I think it's being aware of the broader context Miley emphasizes, that economic arguments don't happen in a vacuum. Be critical when you see calls for more state control presented solely as solutions to social or environmental problems. Consider, as Miley urges, the potential knock-on effects on economic freedom, individual liberty, and the overall direction society might be taking. See the bigger ideological picture he's painting.
Question market failure, understand the returns debate, and see the broader ideological context. Those are solid points to reflect on.
Yeah, they capture a lot of his core message.
Well, we've definitely covered some significant ground from Javier Milei's Capitalismo, Socialismo y la Trampa Neoclásica. We hope this overview has helped clarify his perspective and maybe spark some new thoughts for you.
It's dense stuff, but hopefully broken down a bit.
Absolutely. If you found these ideas thought-provoking and want to dive much deeper into Milei's analysis, his data, his specific arguments, we definitely encourage you to get the book.
There's a lot more detail in there.
For sure. You'll find a link to purchase it right in the description below. Thanks so much for joining us on AI Book Highlights.